The moment the door sealed behind the group of cadets, a hollow metallic echo rolled through the chamber and faded into a thick, almost suffocating silence. The room was vast, yet featureless, a perfect geometric box of smooth white walls that reflected the ceiling light in a cold, clinical glow. No furniture, no vents, no visible controls, not even a seam in the door to let the mind pretend it could be opened from the inside. For most alien cadets, the emptiness itself felt predatory, as though the room watched every breath. Panic set in quickly. One cadet pressed himself against the wall, whispering that this had to be a psychological endurance drill. Another sat down immediately, clutching her knees as if the nothingness around her weighed more than any physical threat. The Galactic Academy had announced no warning, no explanation, no duration. The group had been marched in without context, and the instant the door locked, despair spread like a cold draft. Ethan Ward, the only human among them, remained still for several long seconds as he scanned the chamber. He counted the steps from one wall to another. He studied the sharp corners, the white surface, the texture that barely revealed anything useful. At first glance, the room offered him no resources, but he knew better. Emptiness was never truly empty. Space could be shaped. Materials could be repurposed. A mind could weaponize boredom. He inhaled slowly, grounding himself in the clear air that at least smelled clean. The Academy would not lock cadets in a sealed space without ensuring ventilation, even if the vent systems were hidden. That meant there was airflow, structural engineering, and energy distribution behind the walls. This was not a prison. It was an environment waiting to be understood. Meanwhile, the mood inside the chamber continued to decay. One alien cadet paced back and forth in fast, jerky steps, muttering that he could feel the room shrinking. Another kept striking the wall with the back of her hand, trying to locate a weak point or a secret mechanism. Every strike produced the same dull thud, the same smooth white surface, and the same sinking hopelessness. Ethan approached the center of the room and placed his palm against the floor. The ground was cool, slightly reflective, built from some kind of advanced polymer. He knocked lightly on it, noting how the vibrations traveled farther than expected. The same happened when he struck the wall. The sound did not behave like it would in a standard sealed room. Something inside the structure absorbed and re-emitted pressure differently. His mind cataloged the detail. Not useful yet, but worth storing. He stood and began pacing in wide, measured circles. His boots squeaked faintly as he traced the edges between the floor tiles. There were no visible lines, but he sensed faint depressions, perhaps leftovers from installation. He pressed his heel along the length of one wall, mapping the distance. If he could create a spatial grid in his mind, he could break the room into functional zones. A place for rest, a place for training, a place for observation, a place for experimentation. But first he needed the others to stop spiraling into fear. He caught the attention of the cadet who sat trembling near the corner. She refused to lift her gaze at first, but he crouched beside her and spoke softly, reminding her that panicking would only feed the chamber the reaction the instructors wanted. She exhaled shakily and nodded, reassured by his steadiness. Another cadet approached him, asking what he thought the purpose of the confinement was. Ethan scanned the ceiling light. The fixtures were flush against the panel, impossible to access, but bright enough to cast sharp shadows on the floor. Perfect for visual cues. Perfect for mental focus. He explained that the Academy would not waste resources on a meaningless exercise. If no task was given, then the task was hidden, buried somewhere in the cadets' ability to shape chaos into order. When the other cadets understood that he saw purpose instead of punishment, their breathing steadied. Ethan walked to the far wall again and tested a rhythmic pattern with his knuckles. The sound bounced back with a slight delay and an odd tonal shift, as though the wall was composed of multiple layers with different densities. This fascinated him. Even a layered structure offered possibilities. Resonance, friction heat, pressure response. A primitive lab could be born from those characteristics. But before he could conduct any meaningful experiments, he needed structure, discipline, routine. Emptiness corrupted minds when the mind had no anchor. He looked around the large blank space and imagined how humans throughout history had survived similar psychological conditions. Prisoners who used floor scratches as calendars, explorers stuck in caves who built exercise routines to stay sane, soldiers trapped in bunkers who created systems out of nothing to keep themselves stable. He straightened and clapped his hands once. The sharp sound cut through the silence like a pulse of clarity. Several cadets jumped. Others looked at him with fragile hope. He instructed everyone to gather in the center. Some hesitated, unsure if they should obey a fellow cadet, but his tone carried a confidence that made disobedience feel foolish. Soon, all stood beside him. He explained that they needed order, a plan, a structure to prevent the room's emptiness from consuming their focus. He dragged the heel of his boot across the floor and created a faint but visible line. He repeated the movement again, forming a perpendicular line. The grid was crude, pale, and nearly invisible unless the viewer knew where to look, but it was enough. A map had been born. A world had been divided. He stepped back and announced that this would be their center point. From here, he would expand the grid to create different zones. Without tools, without resources, the only asset they had was discipline. When some of the cadets began to breathe louder, calmer, he knew he had taken the first step toward reshaping their confinement. For Ethan, the room had already begun transforming. Not physically, not yet, but mentally. It no longer felt like a blank, crushing cage. It felt like untouched territory, a blank canvas, a challenge to be conquered not with strength, but with creativity. He placed his palm on the cold wall again and whispered to himself that the academy had just made a crucial mistake. By giving him nothing, the instructors had given him the freedom to build anything, and he intended to prove it. The moment Ethan finished marking the first pair of grid lines on the floor, a subtle shift moved through the group. It was not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The alien cadets were no longer staring helplessly at blank walls. Instead, they watched him with a focus born from desperation and cautious hope. He sensed the urgency in their posture, the way each cadet leaned slightly toward him, as if afraid the only source of structure might suddenly vanish. He understood the responsibility that settled on his shoulders, but he welcomed it. Leadership had never frightened him. Aimlessness had. He measured the room with long steps, dragging his boot in faint arcs that created new lines branching from the center. When he finished outlining a rectangular zone, he pointed at it and explained that the space would serve as a physical training area. He encouraged the cadets to step inside and follow a simple pattern he demonstrated: slow pacing, deep breathing, and rhythmic stretching. For some of them, the routine felt strange at first. Their movements were awkward, their breathing uneven, their hands trembling from earlier panic. But as he continued guiding them, their posture straightened and their lungs filled more evenly. The blank chamber slowly became less hostile. He walked along the walls again, tapping with his knuckles in a deliberate rhythm. He mapped how the vibrations echoed differently depending on the angle and pressure. He categorized each response in his mind. When one of the cadets asked what he hoped to discover, he explained that understanding the room mattered more than understanding the test itself. A person who knew his environment held an advantage over the person who reacted without comprehension. The cadet listened carefully, his eyes following Ethan's hand as he struck another precise tap sequence along the left wall. After finishing his survey, Ethan demonstrated how the cadets could use the reflective properties of the walls and floor to sharpen their focus. He positioned one cadet in front of a wall and told her to observe how her own silhouette softened and sharpened based on distance from the surface. The cadet moved closer, then further, adjusting her breathing to the visual feedback. Another cadet studied the faint shimmer of light that traveled along the floor when Ethan shifted his stance. Soon, several of them began experimenting with the reflections on their own, finding new angles to observe themselves. Once he saw that curiosity had awakened, he expanded the grid farther. He traced new boundaries with slow, firm drags of his heel. The soft squeak of his boot became the first meaningful sound pattern in the room, and the cadets listened to it with unexpected attentiveness. As he worked, he explained that before any advanced activity could take place, the chamber needed distinct sectors. The cadets watched him draw an L-shaped outline and declare it a mental exercise zone, where they would practice memory drills and problem interpretation. Across from it, he added a long, narrow rectangle, which he labeled as the observation path, where the cadets would walk in slow loops to analyze how the air felt against their skin, how sound traveled, and how their own steps interacted with the echo. With each explanation, the atmosphere inside the room grew more controlled. Panic had not disappeared completely, but it had melted into something softer, something manageable. The cadets no longer paced in compulsive fear. They paced because Ethan instructed them to. He watched as they moved along the observation path, some counting their steps aloud, others focusing on how their shadows stretched across the white surface. He corrected their posture, adjusted their breathing patterns, and reminded them to pay attention to the room rather than fight it. While the cadets continued their exercises, he stepped back to the central grid. He knelt and ran his fingertips along the faint lines he had drawn earlier, feeling how the friction from his boot had altered the texture. The lines were subtle, but they were enough to serve as orientation points. His plan required more than isolated areas. It needed flow. A room with no furniture demanded pathways. He connected the central grid to every outlined zone with straight, narrow channels marked by precise boot strokes. When the cadets completed their laps and returned to the center, they noticed the new pathways and instinctively followed them. One cadet, a short reptilian creature with a nervous tremor in his voice, approached Ethan cautiously. He asked why a simple outline on the floor made him feel less disoriented. Ethan told him that the mind seeks structure the way lungs seek air. He explained that boundaries, even imaginary ones, give a person a direction, a rhythm, a psychological anchor. The cadet nodded as if hearing something sacred. Ethan stood again and instructed everyone to gather in the training zone. He began teaching a sequence of exercises using nothing but body weight and the reflective surfaces around them. He demonstrated squats, stretches, balance drills, and breathing regulation. At first, the movements were slow and uncertain, but repetition forged confidence. He corrected posture when a cadet leaned too far forward, adjusted foot placement when another lost balance, and encouraged a trembling cadet to keep moving instead of collapsing to the floor. As they trained, the light in the room shifted subtly with their movements, creating sharp silhouettes that stretched and contracted across the walls. Those silhouettes became additional guides. He told them to keep their bodies aligned with the shapes they saw on the floor, using their shadows as reference. The cadets began adjusting themselves based on their own outlines, synchronizing movement with reflection. Once their energy stabilized, he introduced mental tasks. He formed a line of cadets along the observation path and instructed them to walk while repeating a sequence of numbers he recited. He increased the length of the sequence each time. Some cadets stumbled over the numbers at first, but he reassured them that the goal was not perfection, but engagement. He then assigned a different group to the mental exercise zone, where he asked them to study the faint patterns of light reflected from the ceiling. He told them to track the movement of the illumination as other cadets walked nearby. This task forced them to perceive the room as a dynamic environment rather than a static prison. Every action Ethan initiated began transforming the chamber. Even without tools, the space changed. Boundaries existed, purposes existed, activities existed. The emptiness that had once suffocated the group had reshaped into something responsive to the cadet's presence. At one point, he noticed a cadet staring at the door with a mixture of resentment and fear. The cadet's shoulders trembled from suppressed emotions. Ethan approached him and quietly explained that staring at the door would only drain strength. He reminded him that confinement became bearable when a person created meaning inside it. The cadet listened. then slowly walked toward the mental exercise zone to join the others. When Ethan finally paused to breathe, he glanced around the room and felt a quiet satisfaction. The transformation had begun. The blank chamber no longer swallowed the group in silence. It carried rhythm, footsteps, soft murmurs of concentration, and the subtle scrape of boots tracing new lines. The cadets moved with direction instead of dread. The room felt alive, and Ethan knew this was only the first stage. The chamber would become more than a structured space. It would become something entirely different, something the instructors never expected a human to create. Ethan waited until the cadets settled into the rhythm of the routines before shifting his focus. Order had been established, and with order came the space his mind needed to explore deeper possibilities hidden within the chamber. He paced along the wall once more, but this time his steps were slower, more analytical. Every corner, every seam, every microscopic imperfection became a point of interest. He pressed his fingertips against the cold surface and felt for the subtle temperature differences that he had only briefly noted earlier. The wall warmed slightly under sustained contact, hinting at conductive layers beneath the surface. That detail intrigued him. While the cadets continued their exercises, he lowered himself to the floor and examined the faint lines he had drawn earlier. The friction from his boot had left small particles clinging to the grooves, white, fine, almost powder-like. He collected a small amount by brushing his fingers gently across the floor. The dust clung stubbornly to his skin, suggesting it contained polymer residue. Something about its texture made him pause. If he could scrape more material, he could run basic tests using nothing but pressure, heat, and environmental factors. One of the alien cadets, a slender creature with soft violet skin and trembling hands, approached Ethan with uncertainty in her eyes. She asked if he needed help, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded and instructed her to press her palm firmly against the wall and maintain contact for as long as possible. She complied, though confusion flickered through her expression. After several seconds, she pulled her hand away. Ethan touched the same area and felt the residual warmth left by her skin. He smiled slightly. The wall's material responded unusually well to body heat. That observation alone presented endless possibilities. He told her to repeat the process at several different spots while he watched the reactions. At one location, the surface warmed and softened minutely, enough for him to scrape off a thin layer with the edge of his boot sole. At another location, the surface remained rigid, suggesting multiple types of reinforcement distributed unevenly across the chamber. The more he observed, the more the room seemed less like a simple containment space and more like an engineered experiment of its own. He collected the scraped wall fragments and placed them on the floor. Then he began applying incremental amounts of pressure with his thumb. The particles compressed under force, yet resisted fully flattening. When he rubbed two fragments together, a tiny spark of friction heat flashed between them. One of the cadets gasped in surprise when she saw it. Ethan's eyes narrowed with interest. If friction could generate heat that easily, he could potentially use the material to test thermal conductivity, structural resilience, and energy distribution. With no tools except his body and his environment, he improvised. He instructed two cadets to stand in the mental exercise zone and maintain steady, rhythmic pacing. Their footsteps created a consistent vibration through the floor. Ethan placed a small pile of the fragments at various distances from their steps to observe how different frequencies affected the material. The particles nearest the pacing cadets shifted slightly with every footfall. The ones farther away remained still. That meant the floor had differential resonance patterns, something he could exploit. He arranged the particles into a thin line and dragged his finger across them. The line separated cleanly, revealing that the fragments contained trace amounts of microcrystalline structures. He could not identify them with certainty, but their behavior resembled synthetic crystals used in energy distribution systems. The chamber was not simply built to contain cadets. It was built to test their capacity for perception. The cadets slowly approached him, curiosity overcoming lingering fear. He explained what he observed, showing them how the fragments reacted differently when exposed to pressure, friction, or vibration. A tall insectoid cadet asked him what he planned to do next. Ethan pointed toward the section of the wall where the acoustic echo had been strongest earlier. He walked over, pressed his ear to the surface, and tapped lightly. The echo returned with a metallic undertone, suggesting hollow space or embedded components behind the visible layer. He tapped a second time, this time harder, and the echo deepened. He could almost trace the internal structure by sound alone. He asked a cadet with strong, lance-shaped arms to strike the wall gently, not to damage it, but to create a deeper vibration. When the cadet complied, the entire wall shivered with a resonant hum. The sound that filled the room made several cadets cover their ears, but Ethan listened intently. The resonance clarified the internal layout of the wall. He finally understood. The room was not uniform. It hid an array of conductive channels meant to distribute force and kinetic energy. The Academy had built a training chamber disguised as a cell. He gathered the cadets and explained that the room itself could function as a research subject. The purpose of their confinement might not be to endure emptiness, but to discover what existed behind it. He placed a fragment of scraped material against a warm patch of the wall and observed how it softened just enough to fuse temporarily before falling away. He repeated the experiment with a colder patch, and the fragment remained rigid. Thermal sensitivity varied across the chamber. Intrigued, he decided to test light responsiveness. He instructed a cadet with reflective scales to stand near the illumination panel. When the bright light hit her scales, a spray of reflected beams scattered across the floor. Ethan positioned small piles of particles at different points of reflection to see how light affected them. Some particles sparked faintly, while others remained unchanged. The cadets murmured in surprise. Even the most frightened among them leaned forward with renewed interest. Ethan's improvised experiments transformed the atmosphere. What had been an oppressive void evolved into an analytical space. The cadets no longer hovered near the edges of panic. They knelt beside him, touching the particles, performing small tests of their own. One cadet discovered that stronger pressure caused the fragments to temporarily adhere to each other, acting almost like a weak magnetic bond. Another noted that scratching the wall at certain angles produced faint streaks of luminosity, suggesting phosphorescent properties. Ethan cataloged every detail in his mind. He created a growing list of characteristics: thermal response, friction sensitivity, vibrational conductivity, weak magnetic behavior, optical reactivity. The room was becoming an open textbook of material science, and he had only begun reading it. When he stood up, he surveyed the chamber and saw something remarkable. The cadets were no longer waiting for instructions. They were testing, observing, asking questions. He had ignited curiosity, and curiosity was the antidote to confinement. He stepped back and watched them interact with the chamber. The transformation pleased him. The room had become more than a structured environment. It had become a collaborative laboratory, built entirely from nothing. And as he examined the faint shimmer of light along the floor, he realized something else. This chamber was far more advanced than he had assumed. Its properties hinted at technology far above standard academy training materials. The instructors had hidden something extraordinary behind the simplicity of white walls. Ethan intended to uncover every secret it held. Ethan sensed that the improvised laboratory had awakened something crucial within the cadets: curiosity. What began as a desperate attempt to stave off panic had evolved into a deeper engagement with the world around them. Now it was time to push them further, to turn scattered discovery into coordinated development. The chamber no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a system waiting to be mastered. Ethan rose from the floor and called the cadets to the center grid. They approached with energetic steps, their earlier fear replaced by focused anticipation. He observed the subtle change in their posture: straighter backs, steadier breathing, eyes that no longer darted around the room in search of danger, but instead locked onto him, ready for direction. He told them that discipline would be crucial for the next stage. Exploration without structure led to chaos, and chaos would undo everything they had built. The cadets nodded, some quickly, others with slower, more contemplative movements. He divided the group into 3 teams. The first team would refine the physical routines he had introduced earlier. The second would examine the particle behavior under different environmental conditions inside the room. The third would continue mapping the resonance patterns of the walls and floor. He chose one cadet with a naturally commanding voice to lead the physical team. He assigned a meticulous, observant cadet to oversee the particle tests. The final team was placed under a quiet, analytical cadet who had shown an unusual sensitivity to sound vibrations. Ethan observed how each cadet reacted to being given responsibility. Confidence spread quickly among them. Assigning leaders had been intentional. In a confined space, group cohesion depended not on one person directing every action, but on multiple figures sharing the weight of command. Once the cadets dispersed, Ethan focused on the structural elements of the chamber. The resonance tests from earlier had given him enough information to attempt something more sophisticated. He pressed his ear against a new section of the wall and tapped lightly. The echo returned in a faint harmonic tone. He tapped again, adjusting the pressure. This time the wall vibrated with a deeper, more stable hum. The behavior reminded him of acoustic mapping techniques he had learned during survival training. If he could precisely identify the internal channels behind each segment of wall, he could chart hidden structures. He signaled the sound-sensitive cadet to assist him. She approached and tapped her scaled fingers gently along the wall. Each tap produced a different pitch, which she analyzed with surprising accuracy. She moved with increasing confidence, mapping tonal differences across the surface. Ethan watched her work, impressed by her natural aptitude. He encouraged her to expand her mapping technique across the entire length of the wall, not just in one segment. Meanwhile, at the opposite side of the chamber, the cadet overseeing the particle team had arranged several small piles of scraped material in a neat line. She used her claws to apply controlled pressure to each sample, observing differences in compression resistance. She noticed that when she pressed the particle clusters at a slow, deliberate pace, they generated more friction heat than when pressed quickly. Ethan walked over and praised her observation, explaining that controlled force often revealed hidden properties in synthetic materials. The cadet's face brightened. She continued her tests with renewed motivation, taking pride in every documented behavior. At the far end of the room, the physical training team was running synchronized drills. Ethan watched them for several moments, ensuring that each movement was executed with precision. The leader he had chosen corrected posture, adjusted breathing techniques, and demonstrated new variations of the exercises. Ethan stepped closer and added more complex movements to challenge them further. The cadets followed his instructions with surprising coordination. After several cycles, Ethan noted how the training corner had begun to feel like an actual fitness space. Footprints marked the floor in organized patterns. The cadets' silhouettes stretched across the walls with rhythmic consistency. The room pulsed with controlled energy rather than fear. When he returned to the central grid, Ethan noticed the cadets drifting naturally along the lines he had drawn earlier. The pathways now guided movement around the room. He had not realized how quickly the mental framework had taken root. The once chaotic crowd of frightened cadets had become an organized team. He moved to the observation path and walked its length, listening to the subtle changes in echo as his boots struck the floor. He used the pathway to test how vibrations spread across the room. When he reached the far wall, he drew a new grid branch connecting the observation path to the particle research zone. The cadets saw him mark the floor and instinctively followed the new connection. They began moving between zones more efficiently, no longer wandering in disorganized patterns. He stepped back again and took in the full scene. The chamber, still stark and white, had transformed into something that resembled a functioning micro-facility. The grid lines formed a network. The zones had purpose. The cadets worked with concentration, not fear. Even the lighting looked different. not because the illumination had changed, but because the cadet's presence filled the room with movement, intent, and direction. One cadet approached Ethan, her expression conflicted. She admitted she had feared that confinement would break her, that she would never adapt. She asked how he had known what to do. Ethan told her that a human's greatest strength was adaptation. He explained that confinement could only control a person who surrendered to it. By creating structure, she was no longer reacting to the room, she was reshaping it. She nodded thoughtfully and returned to her team with renewed determination. Ethan gathered the cadets again for a mid-cycle coordination meeting. He asked each team leader to report discoveries. The particle team explained their findings regarding friction heat. The resonance team shared tonal mapping results, pointing out faint shifts that indicated hidden internal support beams. The physical team reported increases in stability, coordination, and breathing efficiency. After listening to each report, Ethan assigned new tasks based on the incoming data. Confidence blossomed across the group. Some cadets volunteered to switch roles to challenge themselves. Others requested more complex tasks. For the first time since the door had sealed, the cadets no longer felt like prisoners. They felt like researchers, engineers, and students in a specialized training chamber. As Ethan stepped back into the center of the room, he realized something significant. The group had crossed a threshold. The chamber was no longer shaping them. They were shaping the chamber. And as he watched them disperse to their stations, he knew that the instructors observing from beyond the unseen cameras would never have expected this outcome. The cadets had reclaimed control of their environment. The transformation was complete. And yet, Ethan felt certain that the chamber had more secrets waiting beneath its silent white surface. The next stage would demand even more from him and from the cadets, who now looked to him as their anchor. Ethan sensed the shift long before anything visible happened. Something subtle tightened in the air, a tension that crawled beneath the surface of the chamber like a restrained current. The cadets did not notice it at first. They were too focused on their assigned tasks, too absorbed in the systems they had built inside the once-empty room. But Ethan felt it. He had spent enough time in controlled environments and enough days in survival simulations to recognize the signs of an approaching change. The instructors were preparing to intervene. He stood at the central grid and observed the cadets one by one. The physical training team executed synchronized movements with admirable discipline, their silhouettes moving in perfect harmony against the white walls. The resonance team continued tapping along the surface with methodical precision, charting new tonal patterns with growing accuracy. The particle research team experimented with subtle environmental shifts, testing heat responses and static friction with increasing confidence. Every cadet moved with purpose, and every sound in the room carried intention, not fear. He quietly called for their attention. The cadets gathered quickly, forming an organized semicircle around the central grid. Some were breathing heavily from exercise. Others clutched pieces of wall fragments or visual notes scratched onto the floor. He looked at each one, proud of the transformation they had undergone. He explained that the test was reaching a critical stage. Although he had no direct confirmation, he sensed the building pressure from the unseen observers outside. The instructors had likely been monitoring every moment, waiting for the cadets to break down. Instead, the cadets had built a structured environment, an improvised lab, and an organized training system. The instructors would not let such an unexpected result go unchallenged. He instructed the cadets to prepare for the possibility of an abrupt end to the confinement. Some reacted with alarm, while others nodded with determination. He reminded them that the purpose of the test had never been to endure stillness. It had been to reveal how each cadet responded to uncertainty. He told them that the moment the door opened, the instructors would evaluate not only their endurance, but the state of the room itself. That meant every mark mattered, every grid line mattered, every discovery mattered. He asked the particle research leader to gather all the scraped fragments and create one final organized cluster in the center of the mental exercise zone. She hurried to comply, her claws clicking softly against the floor. He instructed the resonance team to mark the highest-toned wall sections with light scratches, just enough for visibility, but not enough to damage the surface. The resonance leader executed the task with swift, precise movements. He then told the physical training team to align themselves in formation near the front wall. The team approached with disciplined steps, forming a clean, symmetrical row. Once everything was in place, Ethan guided the cadets into one final synchronized breathing sequence. He wanted them grounded, calm, fully prepared to face the Academy's scrutiny. They inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, aligning their breath with the rhythm he established. The air in the chamber warmed slightly as their breathing steadied. That warmth spread like a steady pulse, merging into the subtle tension Ethan had sensed earlier. Then, without warning, the illumination flickered. The cadets froze. Ethan raised a hand to calm them as the light pulsed again. A faint mechanical hum echoed through the chamber, the first artificial sound the room had produced since the door sealed. It vibrated through the walls and the floor, carrying the signature of shifting internal mechanisms. The cadets exchanged worried glances, and several stepped instinctively closer to Ethan. A deep metallic click resonated through the chamber. The sealed door, untouched since the beginning of the confinement, shuddered and slid open with a long, controlled motion. The light from the outside corridor spilled into the room, casting elongated shadows across the structured grid Ethan had built. For a moment, none of the cadets moved. Even the ones who had maintained perfect pace throughout the test now stood wide-eyed, bracing themselves for the unknown. Then the first instructor stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the stern posture of a senior commander. His black uniform reflected the chamber's white glow. Several more instructors entered behind him, silent, analytical, observant. Their eyes scanned the room with an intensity that revealed both surprise and disbelief. The instructors had expected chaos. Ethan saw it immediately in the slight tightening of their jaws, in the subtle widening of their eyes, in the way one instructor's gaze darted between the clean grid lines and the cadets standing in disciplined formation. The room, once featureless, now contained a structured system: research zones, training areas, marked patterns, organized particle clusters, and carefully mapped resonance scratches. The cadets stood in perfect alignment, their posture firm, their expressions calm and confident. The senior instructor stepped forward and examined the central grid. He lowered himself slightly to trace a faint boot mark line with one finger. His brow furrowed. He stood, walked to the training corner, and surveyed the perfectly synchronized footprints that formed a pattern no random movement could create. He walked along the observation path and saw the evenly spaced outlines. He moved to the particle zone and studied the array of organized fragments. His expression darkened with astonishment. Finally, he turned to Ethan. Ethan stepped forward deliberately, keeping his shoulders straight and his voice steady. He presented a concise summary of the group's work: the resonance mapping, the thermal reactions of the wall fragments, the particle behavior, the grid's navigational function, the training structure, and the coordinated workflow he had assigned. He explained that the cadets had adapted to the environment by assigning meaning, purpose, and function to the blank chamber. He ended his report with a simple statement: "Confinement does not break an organized mind." Silence followed. The instructors exchanged glances, silent conversations spoken through micro-expressions and shifting stares. No one had expected this outcome. The test was designed to expose cadet instability, to pressure them into psychological fracturing. Instead, the cadets had thrived. The human had not merely endured the confinement, he had reshaped it. One instructor finally spoke. He asked Ethan how he had convinced the others to follow him. Ethan replied that he had not forced anything. He merely provided structure, and their minds chose order over chaos. He stated that a confined environment was not a prison unless a person accepted it as one. The instructor studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, conceding respect without speaking it. The senior instructor commanded the cadets to step into the corridor. They obeyed as a unified group, moving in precise formation. Ethan followed at the head of the line. As he crossed the threshold, he glanced back into the chamber one last time. It was still stark and white, unchanged in material, unchanged in architecture. Yet it no longer looked empty. It looked conquered. The instructors led the cadets to the main hall of the academy. Other students stared in confusion as the group passed, faces filled with curiosity and disbelief. Rumors had likely spread already. The confinement test had lasted longer than usual. Many cadets whispered that the locked group would emerge broken. Instead, the group walked with a quiet, collected strength that radiated confidence. The senior instructor addressed the entire academy, announcing that the confinement test had produced unexpected and remarkable results. He did not elaborate, but everyone in the hall could see it. The proof stood right in front of them. After the dismissal, the cadets surrounded Ethan, thanking him with genuine emotion. He told them that the success belonged to all of them, not to him alone. He reminded them that the test's purpose was not punishment, but revelation. It had revealed something important. Unity forged through structure could withstand anything. As the cadets dispersed, Ethan remained in the hall for a moment, reflecting on the experience. He understood that the test had changed him as well. Leadership had not been assigned to him. He had earned it. The instructors had expected a human to fail just like any other species, perhaps even faster due to sensory limitations. Instead, he had demonstrated that adaptability could surpass biological advantage. In the end, the instructors had learned a lesson of their own. Give a human an empty room, and he would build a world inside it.